So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings, where we'll begin with a new text today. So we just finished Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex. We looked at the introduction very closely. So today we'll start with a new text, which will be Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, which is one of the foundational feminist writings, in recent and 20th century at least. And it's got a lot of fame over the years subsequently. After its publication. So today is considered to be one of the really seminal feminist texts like The Goblin Market by Cristiano Rossetti, which we have already done. Now, if you just take a look at the cover page of Gilman's Yellow Wallpaper, you find this is a very colorful cover page, and I'll talk about the color and the use of color and the way the colors become not just aesthetic in quality or anti-aesthetic in quality, but also quite political in quality, and what are the discursive functions of the color in this particular text. Now, a little bit of a biographical background, I think, is in order before we begin or dive into the text directly. So Gilman wrote this story, or a sort of long story, or a novella, if you will, out of drawing on her own biographical, her own personal experiences. And she did suffer from postpartum psychosis, which is a very troubling, a very disturbing disorder which affects women post-pregnancy. So it includes symptoms such as depression, stimulation, hallucination, and obviously it's medically diagnosed, and it's something which is, it's a big disease. It's something which affects lots of women, and it's a very serious disease as is recognized today. But at the time where Gilman was writing this particular story, there's no such classification which was concrete and systematized. So a large part of the suffering of women were classified as this very loose term called hysteria, which could basically mean anything: nervous illness, nervous breakdown. And hysteria was seen as essentially a female malady, something which affects women because they happen to have a womb, uterus. So it's essentially a female malady. So you can see it's very essentialized, very reductionist, and extremely phallogocentric. So it's a phallogocentric projection of a certain kind of weakness on women. So hysteria was a female malady. Hysteria was considered to be a pseudo symptom, a pseudo disease, not really a real disease. So it was looked down upon, it was patronized by doctors, and there were different kinds of treatment which were given to female hysterics. So we have a list of female writers who suffered from hysteria and who drew on those experiences in terms of producing literary texts. So Gilman's book is one very fine example, and also we have Virginia Woolf, who wrote a series of writings, fiction as well as non-fiction, on her experiences with nervous illness and how she was essentially mistreated by the medical industry of her times. So likewise, we have Gilman, who gives a very graphic description of treatment of confinement, treatment through confinement, and rest cure. Now, rest cure is it was a very popular form of treatment at that point in time in terms of looking at female hysterics. It was systematized by someone called Silas Weir-Michel. Silas Weir-Michel was an American physicist who came up with this rest cure method, which comprised confinement, a very selective diet of sort of banana and milk, diets which were supposed to help you put on weight, and taking away any kind of freedom of expression, such as writing. So writing was forbidden to women. They were just confined in a house and forced to rest, and given a certain kind of diet in order to recuperate, in order to make them recuperate metabolically and health-wise. So there's a degree of confinement coercion about rest cure. So the very term rest cure, it seems to suggest is something which is about tranquility and rest and recovery, but it did contain the elements, the qualities of coercion and confinement, of course. So there's a very spatial quality about rest cure, which we will take into account very heavily and very frequently while looking at this particular text, because the space becomes very important. The space of confinement, the space of containment becomes very, very important in this particular writing. And a claustrophobia produced out of that confinement, out of the containment, is something which is a recursive marker in this writing. And also, interestingly, we find there's a very interesting gendered binary operative over here. So we have the female who is suffering from a condition which is not classified, which is not even properly diagnosed by the doctors at the time, and a medical industry which is supposedly treating her is very, very male. So we have the the doctor husband, and that's a very interesting conflation, the doctor husband as a figure of authority, as a figure of sanction, as a figure of someone who's sort of controlling and coercing and confining the woman, as someone who's supposed to know everything, as someone who supposedly knows everything that is wrong with a woman, and someone who is qualified to comment, critique and cure this particular person. But we find throughout the text there are references to the fact that the husband doesn't really understand the protagonist at all. And the husband is a very busy doctor, he's a very rational man, he's someone who seems to know everything about everything. And that obviously is a very, very stereotypical representation of the male-female boundary. I mean, the husband seems to be someone who is socially sanctioned to be a medical practitioner, someone who is qualified to comment on the nervous condition that the protagonist suffers from, and yet he doesn't seem to have any human empathy or any human connect to the protagonist. And that lack of human empathy is something which keeps coming up throughout this particular text. So we have these very interesting issues which we will look at and unpack as we move on: the issue of empathy, the issue of identity, and the issue of agency. And of course, throughout, I mean, covering and connecting all these issues is the issue of spatiality, space. Right? So how is space, I mean, how does space generate agency or take away agency for that matter? To what extent is space responsible for the production of identities, medical identities, existential identities, discursive identities? And all these are connected very, very interestingly and very organically. Because if you remember at the very beginning, at the very outset of this course, we talked about how we will look at the whole idea of feminist writing as a culmination or an entanglement of textuality, discursivity, and experientiality. And because that's something which is absolutely key to understanding feminist writing, so we were looking at it from a particular position. This combination of experientiality, textuality, and discursivity is something which we can't really lose sight of anywhere throughout this course. And this particular book is a very very vivid example, a very graphic example of that kind of combination of textuality, discursivity, and experientiality, because obviously it's a text, it's a written text. And you find, very interestingly, it seems to contain some metafictional elements as well. There seems to be a live quality about writing. So oftentimes you find that, oh, I hear footsteps coming up, so I must stop writing. So there's a degree of immediacy or urgency about the writing. It seems to be happening at the present moment, even as you're reading. So the time of reading and the time of writing seem to be sort of co-planar with each other on certain occasions. So the textuality is very, very sort of explicit, or explicitly present or palpably present in your face. So that's the textuality bit. The discursivity bit, of course, is how the husband seems to be the all-knowing doctor, the all-knowing male protagonist, the all-knowing male figure, who happens to know the answers to all the nervous diseases and happens to know exactly what's wrong with your wife or the female protagonist, but at the same time there's no connect at all at an empathetic level or a human level. There's a discursive bit. And of course the experientiality is experience that the protagonist suffers or goes through in her condition of looking at the yellow wallpaper as some kind of a gory, monstrous, grotesque figure. And she seems to give more and more human quality to the yellow wallpaper, which seems to affect her to a large extent. And of course the yellow wallpaper is very symbolic, as we'll find towards the end of the story, and how the yellow wallpaper becomes an allegory of a confinement, that she is essentially stuck to a wallpaper. And only when she manages to get rid of the wallpaper and take the figure, the symbolic figure, out of the wallpaper, only then is she able to symbolically emancipate herself or liberate herself. And that act of liberation in the end, or that act of, if not liberation, at least subversion in the end, it decimates the husband, or decimates the authority of the husband, who feigns at the end of the story, sort of passes out, as it were. The very phallocentric, patriarchal, all-knowing, all-controlling husband passes out when the protagonist manages to, prise off the wallpaper from the wall and take away and take off the characters, the figures from the wallpaper, because essentially she is the wallpaper. So her looking at the wallpaper is an act of sort of perverse narcissism, and it's something which is which it begins to affect her adversely, because she sees herself as contained and confined and imprisoned in the wallpaper. And only when she's able to move out of it is she able to enact any degree of subversion. So all these issues are very important: medical containment, medical methods of cure, and this whole conflict or tension between the medical narrative and the existential narrative, which are loggerheads with each other. There's no empathy, there's no connect, there's no understanding between the medical voice and the human voice, and that's something that Yellow Wallpaper does very, very well. And of course, this binary is very gendered, and the gendered qualities mapped onto the binary very, very conveniently. So the medical voices, the medical authoritative voices are all male, while the suffering voices are all female. That's something which goes on throughout the story. So that's the brief background, the textual, critical, biographical background, which we need to keep in mind. And then we move on now and dive into the text, The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So if we begin with the text, we find at the very outset the voice is, it carries a sense of immediacy, it carries a sense of urgency, it seems to speak to you as a reader, and that's something which goes on throughout this text. And as I mentioned already, there seems to be occasions where the time of reading and the time of telling seem to converge. The time of writing and the time of reading seem to converge on many occasions in this particular text. So at the very outset, what the protagonist tells us is this, and I start reading the book now: "It is very seldom that mere ordinary people like John and myself secure ancestral holes for the summer. A colonial mansion, a hereditary estate, I would say a haunted house, and reach the height of romantic felicity, but that would be asking too much of fate." So at the very outset, we have this idea of space. It's a colonial mansion. So, you know, the whole idea of colonial mansion is symbolic in quality, because what that automatically and immediately means is that this is a mansion which is built out of the spoils of colonialism, out of the spoils of the empire. So it's brought in, it's got things from the empire, and then it's a mansion now. So it obviously comes at a cost of something. It's a hereditary estate, something which is handed down as a legacy. And also, she says immediately, it seems to be a haunted house. It seems to be a house which is sort of spectral in quality, right? So as I mentioned, this book is, in a way, it's a subversion, a retaliation, or a critique of certain kind of medical practices which are very male in quality. The rest cure method, which was advocated by Silas Weir Michel. And interestingly, Silas Weir Michel was sent a copy of this book. So Gilman, after she published this particular story, sent a copy to Silas Weir Michel, but apparently never heard back from him, unsurprisingly. Okay, so and then she goes on to say, the voice, the female protagonist, goes on to say, "Still, I will proudly declare that there's something queer about it." So the word queer keeps coming up throughout the story in the sense of being strange and uncanny and unhomely, something which is outside the home. So uncanny is, I'm using the word uncanny in a Freudian sense, unheimlich, which means outside the home, something which doesn't stay in the home. And we saw that play of uncanny and this dramatization of uncanny even in the Goblin Market when we read Rossetti's poem. Okay, so still I would proudly declare that there's something queer about him. Else why should it be let so cheaply, and why have stood so long untenanted? So, you know, it's a bit bizarre how very cheaply they managed to get this massive mansion, which is a colonial home, a colonial palace in a way. And why is it that, you know, it's been so long untenanted? So something must have been wrong in it, in a sense. John laughs at me, of course, but one expects that in marriage. So we can see immediately how this feminist voice of discontent, of being derided at, is emerging in this particular passage, where she says that John laughs at me when I say these things because he thinks these are silly, because he's an all-knowing male, he's a rational, all-knowing, all-knowledgeable male. And of course, that's something one expects that in marriage, the husband laughing at the ignorance of the wife, the husband laughing at the silliness of the wife. So that binary is very clearly set out at the very beginning of this story. John is practical in the extreme. He has no patience with faith and intense horror of superstition, and scoffs openly at any talk of things not to be felt and seen and put down in figures. So it's a very empirical kind of imagination that has been described over here, that John essentially will not believe in anything which can be put down into figures. And that again is, that kind of mindset is exactly what informed imperialism, what informed colonialism. The ability to empiricize everything, the ability to mathematize everything, to put everything down into facts and figures. And he would not accept anything outside the parameters of facts and figures. It scoffs openly at any talk about things not to be felt and seen and put down in figures. So unless you can put it down in figures unless he can palpably feel it as a logical material presence. He'll not believe in it at all. So there's no room in his mind for what he thinks are superstitions and belief systems. So we have again a very neat binary emerging between the rational male mind and what is supposedly an irrational female mind or irrational female imagination, which is very conveniently hystericized by the male medical perspective. And now we're told immediately that John is a physician. And perhaps I would not say to a living soul, but of course, but this is a dead paper and a great relief to my mind. Perhaps that is one reason I do not get well faster. So we get this critique tone coming in immediately that John is a physician. And perhaps that's the reason why I'm not getting well as quickly as I would have. Because he tries to pin me down with his physician's logic. He tries to contain and confine me with his physician's logic of rest cure. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why I'm not getting cured in the proper sense of the term. But also, notice how there's a degree of confession about his writing. It's almost like a diary writing that she's writing on a piece of paper. It's a bit of a cathartic, therapeutic impact on the mind or imagination. And she says immediately, the female protagonist, I would not say it to a living soul, of course, but this is dead paper. This is a dead piece of paper, and I can just pour out my mind, pour out my sensibility to it. It's a great relief to my mind. So I can sort of let it absorb what I'm saying. And then the confession is, because John is a physician, there's less chance of her recovering as quickly as she would have if he were not a physician and more of a human person. You see, he does not believe I am sick, and that's something which I talked about at the beginning, that hysteria was a very convenient classification by the male medical vocabulary to confer on the female symptom, which they thought was essentially a pseudo-disease. It's not really a disease, according to the male medical vocabulary. And all the thought was, you can just put a woman in a mansion, let her rest, force her to rest, force her to a certain kind of diet, take away any act of expression, whether it's writing or whatever, and make her sort of calm down, essentially. So this whole idea of calming her down is a very, very phallocentric, patriarchal kind of imposition, calming the woman down. It's almost as if implying the woman is hysteric by default, and all we need to do as doctors is to calm her down, etc. So it's not really a disease in the proper sense of the word, according to this kind of male medical imagination. That's why she says, you see, he does not really believe that I am sick, so he thinks I'm malingering or I'm suffering from some kind of a pseudo symptom. It's not really a disease. Okay. And what can one do if a physician of high standing and one's own husband assures friends and relatives so there's really nothing the matter with one but temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency? What is one to do? So what is my voice against his? And he's supposed to be a qualified physician, a very high standing, very high social standing, a lot of prestige as well, professional prestige. And he tells everyone, all their friends and relatives, there's something really wrong with the female protagonist. She's just suffering from some kind of a temporary nervous depression, which carries a slight hysterical tendency. What is one supposed to do then? But just accept it. So the question of agency begins to emerge already. So who seems to have more agency, the sufferer or the curer, supposedly the curer, the practitioner, the medical practitioner? So the voice of the medical practitioner, the very male voice, it seems to dominate the voice of the sufferer, the person actually suffering the symptom, the condition. My brother is also a physician and also of high standing, and he says the same thing. So we have a series of male figures over here who all seem to sort of collude and say the same thing, that it's not really a problem with the sufferer over here. She just seems to suffer from some kind of pseudo symptom, so all she needs to do is rest and have a certain kind of diet and not imagine things. And there are certain occasions in the story where the husband will tell the protagonist, you should not let your mind wander off into producing stories. You should not let your mind ramble off, and just produce all these narratives, imaginative narratives, because that's bad for you. So imagination is supposedly bad for the soul, bad for the sufferer over here. And what we have instead is a rational mind. So rationality versus imagination. Again, this is a very conveniently and crudely mapped gendered binary. The male being rational, the female being imaginative and irrational to a certain extent. And that is something which the medical vocabulary subscribes to quite heavily. So I take phosphates or phosphites, whichever it is, and tonics and journeys and air and exercise, and I'm absolutely forbidden to work until I am well again. So work over here is writing. So you find on several occasions in the story how she hears footsteps coming in, and then she said, I must stop writing, I can hear someone coming in. And this is the essentially the cure method that I talked about. Now she is confined to a particular house. She's given, she's force-fed with phosphates or phosphites, and she's given tonics, and she's made to journey and made to take air and exercise, and I'm strictly, absolutely forbidden to work. So any kind of work-related activity, including acts of imagination, acts of storytelling, is forbidden to her at this point in time. And who forbids it? It's a male medical practice which forbids it. So again, very, very masculinist kind of dictum that is being conferred on her. Personally, I disagree with the ideas. So she says so clearly that I disagree with absolutely everything they say, because I seem to suffer it, and I seem to have more agency, more ownership on my body, but I don't. And again, we find that how this can be very interestingly and complexly connected to what we saw in Sylvia Plath's Tulips. Because even in Tulips, you find there's a complete act of, a complete experience of agency-lessness, or an exhaustion of agency, or a liquidation of agency, a shutdown of agency, as it were, which is suffered by the female protagonist. And the male space, the medical space in Tulips was very, very male in quality. And we have a similar kind of situation over here, that she seems to disagree with everything that the doctors are saying, but then she doesn't have a voice or an agency because she's not really qualified to comment medically. So we have this conflict between the actual experience, the sentient experience of suffering, and the medical voice of classification and diagnosis, which are completely at loggerheads with each other. There's no dialogue, there's no empathy at all between those two voices. So what does she believe in? What does she think will work for her, what is denied to her? Personally, I believe that congenial work with excitement and change would do me good. So I personally feel that congenial work, conducive work, friendly work, supportive work, along with excitement and change will do me good. But of course, what is one to do? So what is one to do against a very male voice of authority, of some kind of hegemony? So the sense of hegemony is very, very clear and palpable over here. It's medical hegemony. One may push it and say it's medical fascism to a certain extent, because it's trying to sort of contain and confine and impose laws and rules on the sufferer without really taking into account anything which is said by the sufferer herself. Okay. I did write for a while and spy to them. So I know this writing that I'm doing is a bit of a clandestine activity, a secret activity. They're not supposed to know that I'm writing because they wouldn't like it. But it does exhaust me a good deal, having to be so sly about it, or else meet with heavy opposition. So the whole fact that I have to be so secretive about it is exhausting to me, because that's always obviously very, very stressful, not really wanted to be found out, because if they find out I'm writing, they will obviously be mad, and it'll be met with very, very heavy opposition. So the opposition comes obviously from the medical practice, from the medical voice, from the medical institution. So on the one hand, we have this very institutional hegemony of medicine, which is prescribing certain kind of cure, which is obviously not working at an existential level for the sufferer. But the sufferer, the protagonist, the female protagonist, she wants to enact her agency, she wants to assert her agency, a voice to the act of writing. That is going in opposition to what has been prescribed to her. So this whole act of writing becomes a clandestine activity, a secretive activity, as it were. Okay. I sometimes fancy that in my condition, if I had less opposition and more society and stimulus, but John says the very worst things I can do is to think about my condition, and I confess it always makes me feel bad. So she's even forbidden to think of her condition. So the male protagonist, the male authoritative husband, forbids her from thinking about a condition and says that's the worst thing that you can do to yourself. So you're not allowed to think about yourself, not allowed to think about your condition, because that might aggravate it. So think of other things. And I find it very interestingly, if you read something like Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, which is interesting because it talks about a male hysteric, it talks about a shell-shocked male soldier. Because at the time of First World War, the entire idea of hysteria changes. It has a paradigm shift, as it were. So we had male protagonists, we had male soldiers who come back from the war shivering. They were called shiverers, some of them were called malingerers because they were supposedly pretending to be sick. But the fact is, hysteria became very much a male condition. And trauma became very much a male condition. But interestingly, in that story, that novel, Mrs. Dalloway, Septimus Smith, who is the protagonist, this male protagonist, a male veteran who comes back to London after the First World War, he is treated by the two doctors called Holmes and Bradshaw, and the characters of those two doctors are drawn from Virginia Woolf's own experiences with someone called George Savage, who was a doctor who treated her. Unfortunate name. But the fact is, it was the same kind of treatment that we see over here, confinement, not allowed to think about yourself because that would lead on to narcissism and sense of self-absorption, which will aggravate the conditions according to the doctors, and also to be fed on a certain kind of diet just to recuperate at a metabolic level. So it's all very mathematical and rational. There's no sense of empathy, and you're forbidden to think about yourself. You're forbidden to be subjective in quality. So all you are supposed to do is to be outward looking, look at objects around you, look at materials around you, look at logic around you, and not think of yourself at all at an existential, phenomenal level, because that might make things worse, according to these doctors. And that's exactly what John, the husband, doctor, tells her. The very worst thing I can do is to think about my condition, and I confess, it always makes me feel bad. Because then I'm not allowed to think about myself, and that's obviously a complete negation of agency. You're not even allowed to think about yourself as a human subject. That's also forbidden to you, and that's something which is obviously taking away the agency to a great extent. So we have the question of agency coming in immediately. We have the question of spatiality coming in as an ancestral mansion, a colonial mansion, which it doesn't seem to like so much. And of course, the whole idea of experientiality and discursivity are at loggerheads with each other already. So I will let it alone and talk about the house. So she says, I'm going to follow his advice. I'm not going to talk about myself, but I will talk about the house. And we find how the house becomes an instance of extended embodiment, because she feels that the house around her seems to sort of own her to a certain extent at a very embodied level. She doesn't feel really at home with the house, and that home is a bit of an uncanny home for him. So she is obviously suffering from a sense of uncanny as being outside the home, outside the familiar space. So everything is defamiliarized around her, and that experience of defamiliarization, it aggravates that condition to a large extent. So she says over here that I will let it alone and talk about the house. So I'll stop at this point today, and we'll continue with this text in our next lecture. Thank you for your attention.